we're gonna start talking about fabric and some important fabric terminology. So in pattern instructions and in sewing, it's like a new language, and it's really important to understand the different parts of the fabric and the definitions, because it will be referred to in sewing patterns. So the selvages run down the edges of the fabric, and this is the fabric width. So if you recall in the previous video, if you're buying shop bought fabric, there's generally speaking two wicks. There's 45 inches and then there's 60 inches. So in front of me, I have a 45-inch width fabric, and the selvages are going across the edge, and that is consistent all the way down. The length can be completely variable, so you could have meters and meters of fabric, but the width is always consistent, and that's where you'll find your selvages. So another important bit of terminology is the grain lines. Now I'm talking specifically about woven fabric here, and woven fabric consists of thread being woven together at 90-degree angles. Okay, so I know I've got another example. I've got a really good example here of some plain fabric, but with quite a deliberate weave and quite a thick thread. So this is actually 60 inches wide, and you can tell because it goes off the table. But if you're looking at the selvage, which runs across the edge, you should be able to notice threads are going this way and threads that are going that way, and where it is sitting at that 90 degrees, that is called the grain line. And when you're cutting patterns, your patterns will have grain line markings, which will enable you to line up those lines with your fabric grains. So that's what it refers to when it says cutting on the grain. You want to make sure you're lined up with those 90 degrees. So when you are looking at the terminology of these threads, there is actually very specific terminology, but it's quite rarely used in patterns, so don't worry too much about retaining it. But the lines that are woven widthways, so from selvage to selvage, they're called the weft lines, and the way you can remember it is from weft to right. And then the ones that are going down the length of the fabric are called the warp lines, and generally speaking that is the grain that is the strongest. So you've got weft and warp lines. So another very common phrase that actually a lot of people probably have heard of, especially if you watch Sewing Bee, is the bias. Okay, so again, this refers to a point on the fabric. So when you've got fabric that's cut on the grain, it shouldn't move too much unless there is a bit of stretch in the fabric composition itself, but it's a nice strong grain and it doesn't move and shift, which means that when you're starting out sewing, or if you're making something very structured, it's the best line to cut on. However, if you want a little bit of movement to your fabric, you might consider cutting on the bias, which is actually a 45-degree angle. So I'm just going to pop this fabric on the bias, and you can see that by doing that, the fabric has a nice stretch to it. Okay, so you haven't changed the composition of the fabric at all. You've just shifted the angle of it to enable a little bit of movement. Now, inevitably, when you are sewing, when you're cutting out pattern pieces, things will be cut on the bias, like your necklines or your armholes. So it's really important that you manage that as you go along the project, and I will teach you how to do that as we go. But you can actually have whole garments that have been created on the bias to give it a lovely drape. So the bias is actually a very useful and important part of sewing, but it has to be managed properly.